I'm Marc Golub. Welcome to a special edition of In the News as we deal again with the horrific attack on a Chanukah celebration in Monsey, New York, where a 37-year-old man, Grafton Thomas, from Greenwood Lake in Orange County, New York, drove 20 miles to the Orthodox community of Monsey, New York. And around 10 p.m., broke into the home of Rabbi Thane Rosenbaum, who was hosting a party for some 100 guests celebrating the seventh night of Chanukah. Thomas, who was wearing a scarf around his face, brandishing a large machete-like knife, began slashing and stabbing at anyone he could reach, to the horror and panic of guests in the dining room and in the kitchen. Those in the room later described the scene as utter chaos. Before fleeing the scene, Thomas stabbed 5 Jews, critically wounding 2 of them, including Rabbi Rosenbaum's son. One of the Jewish heroes who confronted Thomas, Joseph Gluck, took down Thomas's license plate as he fled the scene, and later that night, Thomas was captured by the police in Harlem. The New York Times has reported that Thomas had anti-Semitic writings in his journal, and it seems that he went out hunting for synagogues to attack. Rabbi Rosenbaum's home is next to his synagogue, and at one point Thomas tried breaking in. Now, in and of itself, the event takes your breath away. A man stalking Jews with the intent of murdering them. But the context of the attack magnifies its significance and the concern and the fear it's engendering in the Jewish community. For suddenly, there's been an outburst of violent attacks on Jews. Since December 8th, there have been 13 physical anti-Semitic attacks in New York alone. On Monday, on the streets of Manhattan, a stone's throw from Grand Central Station, a 65-year-old Jew was punched and kicked in broad daylight. While in Brooklyn, teenagers struck 2 Jewish boys, 6 and 7 years old. Then on Tuesday in Brooklyn, a 25-year-old Jew taunted with anti-Semitic epithets, and then the drink was thrown on him. And at the same day, a 56-year-old Jew was punched in the face. On Wednesday in Brooklyn, a 40-year-old Jew was punched in the face again, and a Jewish woman was hit with a bag by another woman. On Friday in Brooklyn, 3 Jewish women, ages 22 to 31, were slapped in the head and face by a woman. And at the Chabad Lubavitch World Headquarters, Anti-Semites entered and threatened to shoot Jews. And that brings us to this Saturday night in Monsey, when Grafton Thomas slashed 5 Jews celebrating Chanukah. We've all witnessed anti-Semitic acts over the years, including the horrifying shootings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and the Chabad Synagogue in Poway, California. But in some ways, the attacks of this past week feel different. The murders in Pittsburgh and Poway were indicative of deranged hate crimes that are not limited to Jews alone. Crazed gunmen have murdered in churches, as 3 people were murdered at a church service in Texas this past Sunday. There have been shootings in gay bars and at rock concerts. And of course, horrific mass murders in schools. But here, one group, Jews, are being singled out for attack after attack after attack. And it's just lucky that more people were not murdered outright in Monsey, or that they were not more seriously wounded. This attack is different. It feels different. Is any other group of Americans being targeted as blatantly as Jews suddenly are? And this is not to say that America is becoming anti-Semitic in any way. There's nothing to suggest that Americans are becoming Jew haters. And even with the Omars and the Talibs, and even with the ugly BDS movement in the halls of academia, there is no systemic or governmental anti-Semitism. But on the streets, in pockets of American society, a base and vile anti-Semitism that may have always been simmering below the surface is now becoming more and more visible and manifest through acts of violence. Also, there are those who are pointing out that there is anti-Semitism perpetrated by African Americans. This does not mean that the African American community is anti-Semitic. The vast majority of African Americans deplore anti-Semitism. And the Congressional Caucus on Black-Jewish Relations came out with a very strong statement that reads, "We condemn in the strongest possible terms the anti-Semitic attack in Rabbi Chaim Rottenberg's home in Monsey, New York. This surge in anti-Semitic attacks is a disturbing trend both here in the United States and abroad. We cannot tolerate these discriminatory, hateful, and cowardly acts." And of course, many attacks on Jews throughout America have been perpetrated by white Americans and white supremacists. But in the greater New York area, in Orthodox neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and now in Monsey and in Jersey City, the attacks have been from African Americans within the African American community. So what's going on here? And how should American Jews respond? Well, for some insight, I'm so pleased to be joined by a wonderful panel of thoughtful and committed individuals. Let me introduce them to you. Thane Rosenbaum is the award-winning novelist and author who now serves as Distinguished University Professor at Touro College in New York. Thane is the founding director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society, and he's a columnist for JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate, as well as serving as legal analyst for CBS News. We're also honored to be joined by Bishop Victor Brown, the suffragan bishop for the Worldwide Fellowship of Independent Christian Churches and the international bishop and liaison to the United Nations. Bishop Brown also is pastor of Mount Sinai Church, Mount Sinai United Christian Church in Staten Island. And you serve, Victor,
Yes.
on the Mayor's Commission
of Religious Leaders.
of New York. And it's an honor to have you sitting with us here
Thank you so much.
on JBS. We're also joined by Betty Ehrenberg, the Executive Director for the World Jewish Congress in North America. And Betty is the editor of the WJC's Iran Update. And Betty also serves as Executive Director and Director of International Affairs and Communal Relations for the Institute for Public Affairs, the political action and public policy arm of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. And I'm especially pleased to be joined by the editor-in-chief of the Allgemeiner, the leading Jewish news outlet and online Jewish news website. It is so wonderful to be joined by all four of you. Thank you for making the time here on JBS.
Thank you.
Okay, you heard my open. I just want your reactions. I want, one of the things that I was concerned with and wanted all four of you here for different reasons was I wanted you to express how you feel in the aftermath, especially of what happened in Monsey. And then we'll move after that to, what do you think this means? What's the implications for the Jewish community and for American society as a whole, and what should we be doing about this? But first, you heard my reaction to Monsey. Thane, what was yours?
Well, you remember, Mark, we just did the year-end in review.
Yes, we did.
And I would have changed my answer when you said what was the biggest event of the year. I said it was the disconnection of the Democratic Party, its progressive wing, from Israel and Jewish concerns. Now, and I said, there's this other piece, and I mentioned this, what I would call sort of a hunting season against Hasidic Jews, and a casualness about it. After Monsey, to me, it's now the number one thing on my list. The year hadn't closed out,
Yes.
and you pointed out, we might have a few more days, and
Right.
God forbid something else. Yes, something happened. God
Yes.
forbid. It changed my answer. We were told for the last several years that the danger to the Jewish community comes from white supremacists who go into synagogues and shoot them up. You now said it feels different. It does feel different because we were told before, I were one of the people who said it. I was wrong yet again, which is that, yes, the critical mass of anti-Semitism is in universities and in intellectual magazines,
Absolutely.
left-wing extremism, but it's not violent, right? It's not violent. Guys like Thane Rosenbaum get a tough rap. It's hard for them to exist. Jewish students, difficult, pro-Israel Jewish students, it's difficult for them. But nobody gets killed. Nobody gets punched in the face. No one has a brick knock out all of their teeth. That actually has another one that was not one of the 13, but over the last 2 years, there were other events in Williamsburg and in Borough Park. The one that I remember was the brick in a face, knocked out his entire mouth of teeth. This is now violence, and we were told that wasn't it. And the other part of it, which is problematic, is that we got conditioned to blaming Donald Trump and white supremacists. And I'm so happy we have the bishop here.
Sure.
And I'm so happy that you sort of gracefully mentioned the African-American connection to this. It is something that has to be discussed.
Absolutely.
And yet at the same time, I love that you said, and that does not mean that there's anti-Semitism in the African-American community, because it's not. But what we are seeing is undeniably crimes committed by African Americans and Hispanics against vulnerable targets who are all Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox Jews, in different Jewish enclaves in New York and New Jersey. We thought that this sort of thing happened in the kosher market in Paris, and now it happens in the kosher market in Jersey City. So that's what I'm feeling. I'm feeling that our understanding of contemporary anti-Semitism has now changed. It's inverted it. We're seeing it differently. That left-wing anti-Semitism can also be violent. It doesn't have to take place on university campuses. And most especially, it seems to be affecting directly the Hasidic community.
Betty, you also sort of mentioned this during our year in retrospective. So how do you feel now in the aftermath of Monsey?
I feel very sad. I feel more worried than ever.
More worried.
Yes, and I would say fearful for their community. They're very vulnerable. The way they look, the way they comport themselves, they're different and very obviously Jewish, and that makes them very vulnerable to attack. They don't meld in with everybody else on the street, and so people who have hatred in their hearts for Jews or want to harm Jews go to their community. This Thomas Grafton drove 20 miles specifically. Excuses are found for people who commit the crimes. They're crazy, they're angry, they're frustrated, whatever it is. Yes, but how come they're always targeting Jews? And how come they're always targeting the people who look like Jews? That's because they're targeting the Jews. And I'm also fearful that the other members of our community are not quite understanding this. I think I'm actually heartened more than I have been in the past, because I do see statements of outrage and sympathy from mainstream Jewish organizations
For
these Hasidic Jewish communities that have been
Your
targeted.
your point on the year as perspective is you were worried that Jews outside the Orthodox community didn't care enough because they were Orthodox Jews being targeted.
I still think they don't care enough, which is why I was heartened by the recent comments. But something more must be done to make, I think, all Jews feel that they have a stake in what's happening. It isn't just happening to those Jews over there. And I'm hoping that if there's any kind of silver lining in this, although I don't see it, that there is going to be some kind of coming together from different segments of the Jewish community and an increased understanding that we are indeed all brothers.
Oh, I hope you're right. Dovid, the Allgemeiner has done fabulous work in this regard and has even broken some stories. But I want to know personally how Dovid Efune feels in the aftermath of Monsey.
If I had to pick one word, I'd probably go with motivated. Because the question of antisemitism and where this tragic saga ends, I think it's too big for any one person to answer. I mean, it spans millennia. How do we get rid of this? How do we root it out? People have tried, ideas have been presented, but the best that people seem to be able to come up with is some sort of agenda for containment, if you will. The question that we have more, that we have control over, is how do we respond to it? And I think it's incumbent upon us to think about if we are indeed living through a historic resurgence in antisemitism, or even a rebirth of American antisemitism.
Are we?
It remains to be seen.
You're
right?
not sure.
It remains to be seen.
You're not sure.
There's time ahead of us to see, how significant and how serious and how it develops. But it certainly looks that way. It certainly looks that way. But then, if that is the case, we need to be sure that it is never said that the beast of antisemitism reawakened on our watch, and it did so unopposed, or it was met with timid resistance. Mm-hmm. It's our job to formulate the most aggressive, compelling, and impactful response that we possibly can in the face of such atrocities and hatred.
All right, beautifully said. I'm going to come back to the phrase timid resistance in a little while. So, by the way, you're a bishop,
Yes, I am.
but you invited me to call you by your first name.
That is correct.
Okay, so no disrespect meant in any way.
Okay.
So, Victor, it was so important to have you on this panel.
Thank
And
you.
it was so kind of you, and I thank...
And you saved the best for last also, I saw that.
You understand my operation, don't you? I thank Rabbi Joe Potasnik, who you
Yes.
work with, and
Intimately.
he helped put us together.
Yes.
But I'm grateful you went out of your way to come in. You're in Staten Island. You
Yes,
come
I
in. And, I'm saying to myself, okay, so you got 3 Jews and a bishop. And it is in no way to put you in you're not being ganged up on, okay? And I know how sensitive you are to this issue, and that's why one of the reasons why I know your background, I know what you've done. I'm thrilled that I have you at this table.
Thank you.
You've heard 3 Jews
Yes.
just respond to what happened. And you've heard also the fact raised that these particular things that have happened of late,
Yes.
not across the country, not only by African Americans, but there's a feeling at the moment
Yes.
that somehow there is within a pocket of the African American community some anti-Semitism that is being, there's license in some way to actually be violent. So I want to begin the same way I asked
Sure.
the other 3. You heard the story, you
Yes.
read the news, you've seen
Yes.
it on TV. Victor, what was your response?
Let me begin by saying, first of all, I am indeed honored to be here with
Thank you.
such a magnificent panel. But I'm equally disturbed by what has brought us together.
Yes.
I was born in New York. When I was 8 years old, my parents moved me to North Carolina. in 1972, 4 years removed from the end of segregation. I had the chance growing up of seeing and experiencing racism up close and very personal. So having lived through what it is to try to advance while being an African American male, I was deeply alarmed by the fact that these latest incidences of violence have been perpetrated by persons who look like me. I believe that part and parcel of the problem is that there is a lack of understanding or an ignorance on the part of some African Americans of the fact that we have a similar history of pain and a similar history of having been victimized. And so I think what has happened is that many who are perpetrating this have that lack of understanding. And I believe that there are other factors. I think ignorance is a factor. I think one of the other factors is the place that social media has taken on. And many of our youngsters are motivated by what they see in social media. And I believe that social media outlets have been irresponsible in terms of what they have allowed for our youngsters to have access to. We are not born to hate. Hate is a learned response. And I think that many of our youngsters are consumed by what they see in social media, by the music they listen to. And I always grew up being taught that we are what we eat. We are what we consume. And so I think that much needs to be done in terms of education and of redress. And so I'm alarmed by what has taken place, but equally committed to being part of the solution.
When you hear Thane or others
Yes.
say that we don't want to pretend it isn't coming from the African American community, are you insulted?
No, I'm not, because again, I don't think it's primarily coming from the African American community, but I believe these events as of late have, and that is alarming. The concomitant reality to that, though, is that there is also objectively verifiable and empirical data that there is black-on-black crime
Yes.
that is just as high.
Higher.
So that is high, exactly. So it is not just the Jewish community that's being targeted. We, unfortunately, are dealing with the same issues within our own community, and we have to move with dispatch to get to the bottom of it.
Do you feel that there are people like you, pastors with significant church communities,
Yes.
who are speaking out strongly enough to their own parishioners about the total unacceptability of anti-Semitism in general, but really violent anti-Semitism? Is it being said at the moment, or does it need to be said?
Well, I definitely think it does. And as you was asking me the question, I was thinking about, and some of you may remember this, about 2 years ago, there was this knockout game where people were going around and they would just come up on people and just knock them out, hit them for no reason whatsoever. That was done because for a while, the WWE was running a segment where they were doing this knockout thing, and so it caught on in the community. And so I think it's a mirrored behavior. So I'm not totally convinced that some of what is happening is based in anti-Semitism. I think that some of it is based in these youth really mirroring behavior that they may have seen on social
but they're
media.
targeting Jews. I haven't heard of African Americans attacking anybody else. So,
Been attacking ourselves, that's for sure.
yes, that is for sure.
Which is
But they're not
unfortunate.
targeting themselves. Yes, we know, of course, that there's crime within
Sure.
black on black crime.
Yes.
It has been a problem for many decades.
Sure.
But it's not, African Americans are not attacking African Americans because they're African Americans. It's just the crimes committed against each other within their communities. What makes this different is
Sure.
what Marc just said, which was the actual targeting of Hasidic
Sure.
Jews.
Well, the fact of the matter is, it is unacceptable
Yes.
across the board. And I think you were clearly correct when you observed that the African American community as a homogeneous group is not anti-Semitic.
Absolutely.
And so we are equally alarmed, as you are, that is happening. And there are many of us who are speaking out against it and who are looking for means of how we can not just stem the tide, but just get rid of it entirely, because it's not acceptable.
You know, and you're a sweetheart. And anybody who is in the Jewish community and then who paints the African American community with one brush is doing something very un-Jewish. And we're not going to lie, we shouldn't lie, and you don't lie.
Right.
At the same time, we should understand the loveliness of your soul is shared by the vast majority of your community.
Right.
And what I'm hoping is people like you
Yes.
and other pastors are now not going to tolerate it.
Sure.
You can't tolerate it within your community, as there are things that are in the Jewish community we don't tolerate.
Right.
We are joined by one more individual I'm thrilled to have here. It's Marc Schneier. Rabbi Marc Schneier is founder of the Hampton Synagogue in West Hampton Beach, New York. He's also the president of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. He's a leading figure in Muslim-Jewish relations, and he's co-authored with Imam Shamsi Ali a book entitled Sons of Abraham, a candid conversation about the issues that divide and unite Jews and Muslims. And Marc has been critical in leading what has become a possible movement towards peace in the Middle East. He's very close to those in many of the Emirates, and he travels with kings and princes, and he's also a dear friend and a marvelous supporter of JBS, and you now see his services on JBS all the time. Right now we're doing Kabbalat Shabbat before Shabbat begins every Friday night, and you saw his services throughout the summer, and a lovely Kabbalat Shabbat service that was just loved by everyone. And it is wonderful to have you at this panel.
Thank you.
And I know where you just were. Let me make sure you know you're sitting next to David Efune, Betty Ehrenberg. This is Bishop Victor Brown and Thane Rosenbaum, and this is Marc Schneier.
And they have all visited the Hampton Synagogue. Thank you.
Have you been to the Hampton Synagogue?
I'm sure I have. at
Okay,
some
very
point.
good. Anyway, the first question I asked, and I'd love you to speak about it, but I also, and I want you to hold off for a minute telling us where you were earlier this morning. We'll come to that. But I just asked people here for their reactions, how they felt viscerally in the aftermath of Monsey. And what you didn't hear me say at the beginning was, I felt there was something slightly different about this than even Poway and Pittsburgh, where you had crazed gunmen who were doing what people are doing to blacks in churches and white churches in Texas, and gay bars and at disco rock concerts, and even in schools. Here we have a situation where Jews were targeted as Jews, and we've all commented. I want to hear your comment, what your reaction to it was.
I'm joining you today not wearing my Hampton Synagogue hat, not wearing my Muslim Jewish hat, but wearing my black Jewish hat.
Good for you.
And
Explain
if you
what that
want to discuss different books that I've authored, I probably authored the definitive text in black Jewish relations. Shared Dreams, which is the story of Dr. King's relationship with the Jewish community, which I wrote with Martin Luther King III. And since 1990, the foundation has been the national address for the strengthening of Black-Jewish relations, and I believe we're greatly responsible for having rebuilt that historic alliance. When you review, when you examine the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, there was no segment of American society that provided as much and as consistent support to African Americans and to Martin Luther King Jr. as did the Jewish community.
That is correct.
It was the historic alliance of blacks and Jews that brought about some of the greatest social and political changes in our nation. Unfortunately, after Dr. King's assassination, that relationship spiraled downward. And instead of cooperation being the defining element in Black-Jewish relations, it became one of conflict. And since 1990, the foundation has really been at the forefront of restoring Black-Jewish relations to its glorious years. So my initial response to Monsey, that it was coupled with 3 other major anti-Semitic incidents here since Thursday in New York, and how unfortunately all 4 incidents were perpetrated by members of the African American community. And being in the very unique position that I am in this field, I said to myself, in what way could I make some small contribution in remedying, this new situation, now confronting the New York Jewish community? And for me, no pun intended, it was very black and white. And that is that we needed to reach out to African American leaders in the city and for them to speak out, to raise their voices in screaming protest, to combat what I would have considered the moral laryngitis, the deafening silence on the part of African American leaders. That led to Reverend Sharpton and I having our discussion yesterday, which led to this morning, when you will allow me to discuss that, when you ask me to discuss that, because as of now 5:15, this story has gone viral. It's one of the leading stories nationwide in terms of what I consider to be an historic moment this morning in the history of Black-Jewish relations in our city, and really a watershed moment for the African American and Jewish communities.
Okay. I appreciate everything you've said. It's very important to give us that context, and the work you've done is out of this world. I didn't hear how you felt.
I felt violated.
You felt violated.
I felt violated. I felt under attack. But I also, because of my context, I could see clearly what I believe. Listen, you can pressure all the Cuomos and the Blasios and the Trumps you want, but when you see that this cancer is spreading, particularly within a particular ethnic community, I've often said, and I want to share this with the Reverend, I referenced that this morning, that a people who fight for their own rights are only as honorable as when they fight for the rights of all people.
That is correct.
And it became very clear to me that casual Jews become Jewish casualties. But thank God, we have members of the African American community that can stand with us, that can speak out. It was a matter of finding who I consider the most prominent African American civil rights leader in the city to lead the charge. And thank God, it was truly a very, very special moment and experience this morning.
I find myself in a very interesting situation here. On the one hand, it upsets me if something happens in the community and we're afraid to talk about it because we don't want to be politically incorrect or we don't want to offend people. So for a long time, I was one of those who was disappointed that the last administration never wanted to talk about jihadist terrorism and didn't want to talk about the threat that was coming from the fundamentalist extreme wing of the Islamic community. And similarly, I didn't want Jews to pretend that there isn't some anti-Semitism coming out of the African American community. And I noticed that in all of the press releases, Betty, that came out, the only one that referenced the African American community was that by the Simon Wiesenthal Center. All the others seemed to me to go out of their way to act like that was not part of the story. And I understand why, and I had conversations with a number of people that we know and have great regard for, who said to me, you know, if you do I told them we're doing a program on what happened in Monsey and what the situation is now. And they were saying to me, you know, you got to be careful because you don't need to inflame and you don't want to offend. And at the same time,
We didn't say it in the 90s.
yes,
In Crown Heights, when it was blatant. There were 3 days of raging attacks. We had an African-American mayor who, for some reason, gave the impression that he didn't watch the 6 o'clock news. And that allowed this to go on, the violence to go on for 3 days. And it was quite clear then that it was an African-American community versus a Jewish community. And that was very painful, and nobody wanted to say anything. And there were pockets of those who realized that something had to be done, but they didn't get enough coverage, they didn't get enough publicity and exposure, and we still didn't say anything. And here we are, how many years later? Is that 20 years later?
and at JBS, we're
That's the
not
same
going to
thing.
make that same mistake.
Okay.
And that's what never again means. We will never again be silent. But I want to ask the question then of all of you in a different way. The phenomenon that Marc referred to a moment ago, that you talked about eloquently, it's not only from the African American community. And we don't want here at this table to suggest that that's the only focus. I don't want it to be overlooked. I think it'd be a mistake not to acknowledge it and to hear, Bishop, what you had to say. Victor, you were, again, I just want to give you the microphone. You just talk for an hour and a half. But I don't want to let anybody who's watching JBS think that any of us believe that anti-Semitism is limited to or only a product of the African American community, and there is serious anti-Semitism that is bubbling up in ways that I never expected to see in my lifetime.
But it's coming from so many angles. It's coming from the white supremacist angle and the ultra-right. It's coming from the African-American community or certain segments of it. And it's coming from the jihadists and certain segments of the radicalized Muslim community, which you mentioned. And I feel, look, the Jewish people are being squeezed from all over. So that just, and added, when you ask me how I felt, and I tell you fearful, it's coming, how many in the past few days? 13
Since
assaults,
December 8th,
physical assaults.
13, correct.
Not swastikas on a wall.
Correct.
Physical assaults.
Right.
And fast and furious.
I
And
don't-
it's overwhelming.
I don't think, though, that we can negate the fact that we have and are feeling the vicious, divisive winds blowing out of the Oval Office.
Oh,
that
yeah,
has
okay.
significantly
Yes.
created a national climate wherein we've experienced an uptick in hate crimes throughout the nation.
I am always reluctant to shift both focus and responsibility. I don't care who's in office. I don't want my children doing anything that that would make me not proud of them. And I don't believe, you showed me a picture of your gorgeous daughter.
Sure.
It doesn't occur to me that your daughter, I don't care whether she loves Trump or hates Trump, whether she loved Obama or hated Obama, was going to let that affect how she treated other people. And I'm sorry, I know it's fashionable to blame Trump for everything. I don't believe Trump is the reason why we have anti-Semitism.
Marc, I might add, it's also wrong to focus on youth and children. If you look at these last incidents here in New York, they were not carried out by youth or children. The gentleman who perpetrated the attack in Monsey on Saturday evening was a 37-year-old man. To look at the people who perpetrated the attack in Jersey City, all right, these were grown adults.
What's your point, though?
My point is that let's not also fall into the trap
I think it's only young people.
of labeling not only young people or black youth in particular.
Yes,
Right? These are adults
Yes, I didn't
who
hear.
are committing. These are adults who are committing this crime. So I'm saying when you use the example of our children or the youth, we have to be very, very careful to also acknowledge the age group that are committing these crimes. And I must tell you, your point before about Jewish organizations not calling out, let's say, the African American or the Muslim or the Latino communities, well, I respectfully question the authenticity of those relationships. Because if you have an authentic relationship with leaders from other communities, then there should be absolutely no issue picking up the phone and saying, listen, our community, the Jewish community, is under attack. And many of these attacks are being perpetrated by members of your community. We need you to stand with us now. And the fact that there are a myriad of Jewish organizations that do not take that tactic, I respectfully question the authenticity of their relationships with the leaders of those communities.
They will often tell me they're doing it behind closed doors.
Again, I question the authenticity of those relationships.
You've been writing about this all the time. As you've heard the discussion, you've heard Victor, you've heard Marc, you've heard any reaction to anything you've heard.
I think there's also another factor at play here which is interesting to note, and that is, the advancements in the way that information moves today, the information age. This is something that Victor
mentioned.
touched on slightly earlier on. I imagine that in the past, in years past, certainly in certain eras of American history or recent American history, being an anti-Semite or being a bigot might have been quite an isolating experience. You envision this crazy living in their mother's basement or camping out in the woods somewhere. And today, the rise of social media platforms and a whole bunch of different social media platforms has created the opportunity for communities of haters to coalesce. And that was the case with the Pittsburgh shooter. It was very active, engaging a community on the social network Gab. But in some of the shootings that we've seen that were live streamed, for example, not just against the Jewish community, but Christchurch and on Facebook or on Amazon, it's almost as if the perpetrators were performing. They were acting to a community or on behalf of a warped, hateful community. And I think it's those communities that really can provide encouragement and refuge for hateful ideologies. And the Reverend mentioned it briefly, but I would go so far as to say that the lack of full responsibility taken by the leaders at various social media outlets leaves them with some blood on their hands.
Exactly.
And they have in the past sort of explained away, and there's a lot of discourse and dialogue, but in the end of the day, when it comes, we know that they have the capacity to eliminate completely, this type of motivational hate speech, if you will, on their platforms. When it comes to copyright infringements, we know how active they are. When it comes to pornography, we know how active they are to completely eradicate it so that it doesn't appear on their platforms and they don't face legal challenges, etc. There is a whole lot more that can be done to really shut down these communities and make it much harder for groups of haters to coalesce and reinforce each other, and in the end of the day motivate the kind of action that we're seeing.
Okay. Victor, you did mention social media, I understand.
Yes.
I think that's a discussion in and of itself. I don't know that you and I see totally eye to eye. I am a real defender of, I would err on the side of a broad definition of the First Amendment. And I think the minute you start letting social media decide what they think is hate speech, the first thing you're going to lose is your right to speak. But that's a separate issue. I want you to respond to anything you've heard, but I want also, given what the writing you've spent your life doing, you're both a novelist and you've written nonfiction. You're a lawyer and you're an analyst for CBS. You're a law professor, a distinguished professor at University professor at Touro College. You bring a whole galaxy of experience to the question I want to ask you. Very often, there is in the face of anti-Semitism this question asked: what did we do? And it's almost as if the Jew wants to understand, is there something we could do differently that would end this hatred of Jews? As if it's a rational response to something we have done. And we have seen in the New York Times, and we've seen in the Washington Post, maybe in the Wall Street Journal, I forget now, an actual suggestion that Monsey was the product of the way Jews were coming into the community. That if Jews had not tried to come in and gentrify, was the word they used, Monsey, this never would have happened.
Jersey
City, yes. And I'm personally saying, I'm horrified when a media outlet turns it around, and I feel so sad when Jews buy into it. And so often Jews will say to me, Rabbi Golub, why is there anti-Semitism? What have we done to create this hatred of us? As if they want to know how they could change. And if they changed, the anti-Semitism would go away. So I've thrown all this at you at one time. Just respond.
Well, we've had a long history of Jew hatred in which Jews there would be punished on both ends, right? Good example is they're blamed for being invaders of other countries as cosmopolitans, but at the same time, when they have their own self-determination, they're being blamed for being land grabbers of Arab land. So which is it, right? Is it that you don't want them in your societies because you don't want their cosmopolitan globalist outreach? Because if you don't want them, then they have to go somewhere. But we don't allow them self-determination. So, right, we don't allow them and when they try self-determination in Israel, we blame them for stealing other people's land. So, yes, on both sides, Jews, they can't win this argument. I think you're onto something when you talk about gentrification. Again, it fits into a pattern that is very comfortable for newspapers, especially mainstream media, universities. What is it? Well, it's the intersectional universe. Dark-skinned people have been oppressed by white-skinned powerful elites throughout history. And they are to be blamed for all the social ills and pathologies that exist to create these economic inequalities or whatever levels of prejudice they see. And so therefore, Jews, oddly enough, especially to Jews that have any sense of history in the Holocaust, all of a sudden are white, privileged, powerful people. And for whatever reason, attacks against them don't count. We see this on university campuses. We see this in intellectual magazines. It doesn't seem to matter. It's really, as I said, I think I said on one of your programs, a professor of Oberlin said that they shouldn't study the Holocaust because it's essentially white-on-white crime. White-on-white crime, as if to say, well, if it's white-on-white crime, it doesn't really matter. Crime is only important if it's committed against a dark-skinned person. So this plays itself in. If you think about it, there's a direct correlation between looking at Zionists as violators of other people's lands, marauders of other people's land, And religious people who went to Monsey or Jersey City, and by the way, Bishop, I for a number of years lived in Harlem, and I'm not a religious Jew, but I felt the resentment of the gentrification of all of those brownstones all of a sudden being owned, and oftentimes it wasn't only Jews that lived there. A lot of white people moved into Harlem, but it did seem to me that the people who were being blamed were Jews, as if this is what they do. So again, to contextualize, it's not unlike what we see in the Middle East, in Israel. It's a similar argument between Palestinians and Israelis. And I fear that we have the same reason there's a hesitation to point the finger at the African American community. One, because I suspect, Jewish Americans, as you said, they're looking for self-blame. They're looking, what did we do? What could we have done better? Maybe we are wrong, right? This is what the entire Upper West Side of liberal Judaism is about. They've replaced Judaism with something called Tikkun Olam that is just about their own virtue signaling. Aren't I special that I can criticize my people? Look at me. I call it moral narcissism. Look at me. I'm Jewish and I'm critical of my own people. So I don't see Jews standing up for themselves. I thought when Rabbi Marc Schneier was talking about Jewish leadership, and he said, I wonder about the authenticity of those relationships, I also thought, I wonder about the authenticity of the leadership itself. Where are these Jewish leaders? Where are they? Do we have them? I don't seem to feel led by Jews. Let's just one last comment. I want to say, as someone who is not a supporter of Donald Trump, and I'm not particularly upset by the impeachment. I'm okay with the impeachment. I don't understand why Jerry Nadler, Chuck Schumer, and Adam Schiff are seemingly not as involved in this as they are in the impeachment of Donald Trump. Where are they? Are you just a congressional leader for your community? Because I think as a Jewish American, you owe Jewish Americans some leadership too. And all I see, Jerry Nadler, is you talking about the impeachment. And by the way, Jerry Nadler goes to my synagogue. And next time I see him, I'm going to ask him, what are you doing? Yeah. Are you Jewish or you're not? Because if you're Jewish, you're leading.
Well, let's be a little bit fair here. That's what he's embroiled in now, and he's embroiled in and deeply embroiled
No.
in. No. Jerry Nadler has a very long pro-Israel history, every vote pro-Israel, very knowledgeable about Iran, very knowledgeable. I mean, you cannot
You're
say.
both right.
Can I just add
let's have some
let me
fairness.
just ask, right, okay, so let me ask one more comment. We spent a week ago talking about, during the year end, actually it was a prior show, the 107 congresspersons
Yes.
who wrote. There are Jews on that
Will you
list.
mention what this is?
Yes. So there was a number of weeks ago, this is in connection with Mike Pompeo's announcement, that from the State Department's perspective, the settlements would no longer be considered illegal, although the term of art was actually not even illegal, meaning to simply say it's not consistent with international law, which is not exactly the same thing as saying it's illegal, but that's a technical point. So 107 Democratic senators, and you were really worked up about this. This was a big deal for you because you said that's like the entire Democratic,
It was half.
decided to sign a letter that, in my view, was completely based on utter ignorance, and it was socially fashionable for them to sign that, in which they blamed Donald Trump's entire positions towards Israel and the Palestinians, and started with that. And I'm saying, none of you on that list seem to be as upset about dead Jews in New York as you were about complaining about a State Department's redefinition of what is anti-Semitic in connection with, because this was based on a State Department policy of adopting a definition of anti-Semitism that included denying Israel the self-determination of the Jewish people and calling Israel a racist enterprise. And so that was where you got worked up, but no one seemed to get worked up about dead Jews or harassed Jews or Jews that got punched in the face. And so I want to know, Jerry Nadler, I want to know, where are you on that? Because I do see you on TV here, but I don't see you pounding the pavement. Similarly, on university campuses, people go nuts about hummus. right? If hummus comes from the West Bank, it's a protest. If an IDF soldier comes to speak, you get shot. If Thane Rosenbaum comes to your university, people are screaming with outrage. I don't see them screaming about dead Jews.
Can I say something?
Hold on one second.
Sure.
So you're listening to all this,
I very intently.
and I hope on some level it's fascinating to you as well. You said earlier you experienced racism.
Without question.
Okay. And that is part of the history of your people to this day.
That is correct.
Do African Americans ask the same kind of question Jews ask? What are we doing wrong? Is the racism that we're experiencing our fault? My sense is you don't.
No, we don't.
Okay. Isn't it interesting to you to hear Jews say the similarity of discrimination and at the moment physical abuse
Yes.
to a Jew very often is internalized Jewishly? It would never occur to you.
We're in two very different places.
In what way?
In what way? That if you look, it's very chic, particularly around Passover time, to have these interfaith seders bringing African Americans and Jews together because we had the shared experience of slavery
Yep.
and then being released from bondage. But if you look at the post-slavery experience, they cannot be more opposite. According to our tradition, God takes the Jewish people out of Egypt, puts them in the desert for 40 years, quarantines them. Not even a single member of that generation can enter the promised land. Look at the post-slavery experience of African Americans. You're free. Try to rebuild your lives among the same people that were your taskmasters, the same people that enslaved you. It's very, very unfair.
Is it unfair to say, isn't it interesting that an African American does not blame himself
Because
the way the Jew blames himself?
Because,
And by the way, you're
because
a rabbi.
the Jewish
Do you have
community.
people who ever asked you the question they asked me?
Well, I have it in Black Jewish relations. I discuss this all the time.
Have Jews ever said to you, what are we doing wrong that there's anti-Semitism?
It's a very simple response.
But have they ever asked?
It's,
Have you
of
ever-
course they have, and I've spoken about this. It's our very existence. But the point I want to make, and I want the bishop to hear this at least from me,
Okay.
that we should also, in terms of this conversation, maybe it would be very productive to offer a history seminar in terms of where the Jewish people are today. 2019, there has never been a greater time in 2,000 years to live Jewish and to love Jewish. When you look at
I don't
2,000
understand.
years,
I agree with you.
when
But
you
what's
look
the
at
point?
the
What
point is
is
when
the
you look at
point?
2,000 years of oppression, persecution,
How does it
of
relate to
Inquisition
relate to
crusades,
this
because
subject here?
when Thane Rosenbaum brought up the issues of IDF soldiers that are being protested or on college
that
campuses or
upsets
homeless,
you.
and this of course upsets me, but thank God in 2019 we have an IDF for people to protest.
By the way, thank God-
we are forgetting that context. I can't even fathom what it must have been like to have been a Jew 75 years
agree-
ago.
I agree with you.
I can't even fathom. So I think we also need a little context in
I
terms
just-
of this conversation
I just don't
as
understand
to
how this
where we are
relates to what
today.
we're talking about. And one of the things that I am aware of is, for all of those who say, this never would have happened if there were a state of Israel. By the way, I'm watching what's happening in Europe, and the state of Israel makes no difference. And now I'm watching what's happening in the United States. The state of Israel makes no difference.
Makes
And
a
it-
huge
No,
difference.
no, it doesn't.
In terms of our self-honor, in terms of
For
our
you.
self-dignity,
For you.
for the Jewish people.
For you.
For the Jewish people. For
We're
the
talking
first
about-
time,
we're talking
for
about
the
the average
first time in
Jew.
2,000 years.
We're talking about the
No.
Jews who are living all over America,
No.
who are now saying this, and I would love to know what everybody says, and I'm fascinated to hear as you hear this. Would you be afraid to wear your yarmulke anywhere in New York?
I'm not even afraid to. I'm more afraid to wear my yarmulke in Berlin than in Bahrain. I'm surely not afraid to wear my yarmulke here in New York.
How about you? Would you be afraid to wear a yarmulke anywhere
I
in
think,
Europe?
by the way, that's an important distinction, right? We were talking before about Hasidic Jews being the central focus of these attacks. So it seems. I think there is a distinction between the experience of what I might call a conspicuous Jew and an inconspicuous Jew, right? If there are physical, external identifying factors. And I would say that I've lived my whole life as a conspicuous Jew. I always walk around wearing yarmulke, and not just in New York, in Europe, in many different countries in Europe, in Africa. And I can say that there were a few places where I have felt completely at home walking around with a yarmulke. And New York is one of those places, and it remains so. South Africa was, interestingly, another one of those places. But in Europe, you feel different.
It's different. Is there any place in America you think you'd be reluctant to wear a yarmulke?
There are places where it might be more or less concerning, but I don't think there would be any place where I would be reluctant.
Okay. So if somebody said to you, Dovid, how frightened are you? What's the answer? Betty, I feel you feel frightened.
I feel very protective of that community.
Do you feel frightened?
I think it's also a personal thing.
Are
I don't
you
know.
frightened?
No.
By the way,
not
I don't
really.
feel frightened at all. And it's
Not
not
really.
like I don't see what's happening. I don't feel frightened, though. And I don't want other Jews to be frightened.
Right.
And I don't want them to go into hiding.
But I think also, there is, I guess people's instincts and emotions are, a product of their background and environment. And, the environment that we're facing now here in New York is not so different to what we grew up with in England. I mean, I remember walking to shul with my father, who was a very conspicuous Jew in Brighton in the south of England, and having cars drive by shouting anti-Semitic slogans was normal. It was just par for the course. It happened every second week. So I think, maybe as a product of that, there's a certain, I wouldn't say immunity, but less fear, certainly.
Are you frightened?
I am frightened for the Hasidic community. I am not personally frightened yet in the United States, but I do think that what we've seen, if you look at ultra-right, alt-right violence against Jews, synagogue shootings, which you're quite right, it's not confined to synagogue shootings, but up until recently, that's where the violence came. It has seemed as if the anti-Semitism of the left was really anti-Zionism that was sort of masking as a human rights issue instead of just blatant anti-Semitism. But I do think the game has changed. I think that what we've been seeing over the last 2 years, we haven't been paying enough attention. It was slowly happening throughout the enclaves of the religious Jewish communities of Brooklyn. But clearly, since December 8th, something else is happening. And we are seeing something that, what I'm concerned, I'm not personally worried, but I do think the fact that it appears to be open hunting season on religious Jews in their own religious enclaves, and I'll repeat it again, I don't think, other than platitudes, it doesn't seem to me that anyone seems to care very much. For instance,
but
let me just know.
But the game is changing. I agree with you.
But-
because we've never had so many other faith communities and faith leaders stand with us in
Marc.
combating anti-Semitism. You're right. The game has changed.
Yeah, but I would.
It's on Staten Island.
but
though.
can-
It
can-
happens-
can-
it happens often on Staten Island.
Yes,
where
happens all over.
You know-
happens in terms
Yeah,
of
which we
there
never
being
had
a
in Jewish history
standing
before.
with the Jewish community.
Let me say, gentlemen and lady, I may be the only person here that when Marc Golub read the statement from the Black Caucus, I was not impressed. It doesn't mean anything to me. You want to know why? Want to know why? Because the Black Caucus was partly responsible, if not mostly responsible, for the resolution that the Congress was going to pass condemning anti-Semitism. And it was the Black Caucus that, remember, they didn't want to censure Omar and Tlaib, or was it Omar? And that all of a sudden it went from a bill out condemning anti-Semitism to a bill simply about racism, and it included everybody. And so if the Black Caucus really feels strongly about it, now's the time to revive something that's a really strong statement. People just say things. They don't mean anything.
But that
And
statement, just to clarify, wasn't from the Black Caucus. It was the Caucus on Black Jewish Relations, which is different and smaller.
Which
Okay, well
is
then,
part of it.
okay, well then, all right, I feel better about that, because the Black Caucus,
Because if you think of, let's say, a John Lewis, who we pray for,
Yes.
who unfortunately is going through such a life challenging,
Illness.
such a
Yes.
life challenging illness right now. You know, you think of the John Lewises, you think of Martin Luther King's in terms of his supreme advocacy. He's one of the greatest champions of the state of Israel. Sometimes these caucuses, need to be reminded, need to be challenged. As we're sitting here, as a group of prominent Jews around, this table, there are people grieving in Texas in terms of what happened in the church, and for them, that's, with all due respect, that's more of a priority issue for them, or let's say for Sheila Jackson Lee, prominent member of the Congressional Black Caucus, than what's happening here in New York right now. And I think that we also need to be somewhat, sensitive that people do have other priorities without in any way neglecting or negating what we're going through. But different ethnicities have different priorities.
I think that that there's something more that we're wanting. I mean, I think there seems to be some kind of consensus here that words are not enough. The Reverend and I were talking about there was a big event at Tree of Life when the whole community of all faiths were brought together. It was deeply moving, and I think for the first time, for an important time, the Jewish people felt we were not alone.
Yes.
Last night, the bishop and I were together at an event that was pulled together by the mayor, who spoke, Tish James, the Attorney General, Hakeem Jeffries, the Congressman, Yvette Clarke, the Congresswoman. There were Christians and Muslims and Jews, and we all stood together. But the issue is, what do we do now? We have to go beyond the statements and beyond the words.
Exactly.
And this is going to be the hard work. This is going to be the hard work because it's going to take law enforcement, it's going to take legislation and consequences. That's going to be hard. And it's going to take education for the long term as well.
The very message articulated by Reverend Al Sharpton this morning.
Tell us about your meeting.
So it wasn't a meeting. What happened, Reverend Sharpton called me yesterday. We've worked for many years in terms of rebuilding Black-Jewish relations in the city. And I quote, he said, "Marc, I'm terribly disturbed by these anti-Semitic attacks. And I quote now, in particular, because many of the perpetrators are members of the African American community, and we have to do something about it." And today, he invited me up to Harlem on 145th and Lenox, to his House of Justice. And there he had more than 40 prominent African American ministers, civil rights leaders. The bottom line is that Al Sharpton was unequivocal in speaking out against anti-Semitism. He was unequivocal in speaking out not only about the anti-Semitism, but the fact that at least the last 4 incidents since Thursday have been all perpetrated by members of the African American community and others who were there. And if you look at the trajectory, particularly of Al Sharpton, as a civil rights leader, Al Sharpton of 2019 is not the Al Sharpton of 1989, which was very, very clear in terms of his resolute.
Can you explain what that was, the 89?
What? What? I'm sorry,
Thane,
what?
Part of the problem,
Yeah, because I'm looking at
those
this.
of us who know Sharpton's history,
Yeah.
while I do not doubt anything you're saying, it sounds fantastic in the literal sense of the word. Because the last person that I would go to, I would run to Bishop Brown. It's amazing
You
to
see,
me
because
that
that's
Al
the
Sharpton,
mistake,
who had
Marc,
who,
that's the mistake we make in the Jewish community
but you understand
that
what
we
you
choose.
understand. Wait a minute, you
Of course
understand?
I understand.
Okay.
I have
What
the same
Thane is
issue.
I'm not so sure young Uncle
I have
Rosenbaum
the
would be
same
dead
issue.
if it wasn't
I have
for
the
Al
same
Sharpton.
issue.
How's that?
But I can tell you that when it comes to the Jewish community,
nonsense.
we often look to choose the leaders of other ethnic or faith communities. The bottom line is that when it comes to the African American community of this city, the most prominent, preeminent leader, whether you like it or not, in the African American community is Reverend Al Sharpton.
Hold on. Do you think that's true?
That is true.
Al Sharpton within the African American community is the most respected leader you've got?
He is one of our leaders, yes. He's not the only leader.
Name
And I
another.
think that's the mistake that other ethnic groups make as they try to analyze the
Thank you.
African American community. I don't think we don't do this when it comes to any other community. Who is your leader? There isn't one. I'm a leader in the community,
You are.
and there are many other clergy who are of like mind. I think, though, what often happens in dialogues like this is we miss the forest for the trees.
Please.
We get caught up in majoring in the minors, when I feel that you've got a situation here where there have been people who did not deserve to be victimized. What are we going to do about that? We can talk about the context, we can talk about our differences, but as I sit here and listen to this, that does not answer for me, what are we going to do about it? And I don't think that there is one solution, because we didn't get here overnight. If there was anything that Charlottesville should have taught us, is that racism is alive and well in this country. And as I watched the television, and what I saw to me was a throwback to the 60s. Now, earlier in this segment, I mentioned about Donald Trump, and you quickly dismissed me. But the fact of the matter is, our elected officials do have a responsibility in terms of setting a national climate. So the David Dukes of the world are ecstatic that a Donald Trump is the president. The rhetoric that has continued to come out of this man's mouth has been racially divisive. And there are people who are eating it up. And as far as I'm concerned, conflict avoided is not conflict resolved. So we can say, well, we're not going to talk about Trump, but how can you deal with these hate issues and ignore that? Because that is part of the problem. And I would say if it was Obama in there and he was engaging the exact same racially divisive rhetoric, I would be as upset with a president who looks like me as I am about Donald Trump.
Okay, I respect everything you've said, and the reason I tried to duck the issue was twofold. Number one, I don't believe that's why there's anti-Semitism in America at all. And I believe that one who
It
understands...
doesn't help. The national
no,
tone that we have doesn't,
let me say it again.
it doesn't help.
Doesn't, it's not in my mind. It totally, in my mind, distorts the issue and deflects attention. There's a famous story about the Roman emperor walking down the street, and he passes a Jew, and the Jew doesn't bow. And the emperor says to his soldier, cut that guy's head off. And they walk another block, and they come to another Jew, and he bows. And the emperor says, cut that guy's head off. Why are you cutting it? He bowed. It doesn't matter to the anti-Semite what the Jew does. And it doesn't matter who's president of the United States. And the other reason why I duck it is, not everybody who's watching JBS right now sees it as you do.
Right.
And I don't want to be in the position of having to represent them. I've got nobody at this table who would say to you, excuse me, Victor, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And therefore, for those two reasons, I try very hard not to let Trump be the discussion ever on JBS. So that's why I duck it.
Right.
I think it misleads, and also it's not black and white to a lot of people. And if I had somebody on here who felt as strongly as you did from the other side, I'd let the two of you go at it. But I don't have that.
But it's important to acknowledge
I would
these
think, having
sentiments
been
that
asked
are not
to come
only,
on the panel.
but exactly, it's important
No,
to
no,
acknowledge.
no, not at all.
Mark,
I-
it's important to acknowledge not only what the bishop has shared with us, but this is an overwhelming sentiment within the African American community. It's
That
important
what?
to, in terms of what he expressed
Okay.
about the president. In the African American community, he's spot on.
But,
Spot on.
but Mark, do you think that what he's saying, I mean, this is fascinating to me, that the whatever is happening in the Oval Office creates a permissiveness within the African American community to attack Jews?
No, but it's not just the African. Well, I pointed specifically to Charlottesville because that wasn't African American. But hate mongers.
It was as
feel-
Jewish as it was African American.
And hate mongers feel emboldened by this particular administration to involve themselves in being demonstrative about their racism in a way that you did not see under past administrations because many of them did not feel they had a platform to do that. Throughout this president's campaigning, it was always divisive language. Mexico sends their worst to this country. That is absolutely absurd. Not to mention not true.
But what I'm concerned about, Victor,
Yes.
is that what you're saying, it sounds like the natural implication is that the hate mongers within the African American community will also feel a permissiveness to attack neighbors of theirs who they see having gentrified and changed their neighborhoods.
I'm
and
saying
you're
that-
saying it's because there's Trump in the office has said to anyone who has hate against the other, I can act out of my hate.
It is wrong across the board.
No, I know
it's
you know that.
exacted by an African American or anybody. It is wrong across the board. And it is time that all of us step into the arena of responsibility. So I'm not doing this. I'm saying that where there are persons who can be part of the solution, it's not going to happen by just looking at one particular thing. It's going to take elected officials. It's going to take religious leaders. It's going to take forming coalitions from the grassroots. It's going to take us all working together in order to deal with this.
And I would just add, just to reinforce the point that you made, that there's also a danger in a politicized narrative in response to hate, because it necessarily excludes the other half of the country from the discussion and from the effort that needs to come in response to it. What happens is when people hear this narrative, well, it has something to do with Trump, half of America that supports him is out. They've just left the table. And I think, it's so important that this doesn't become a politicized issue, and that there is a unified focus on the issue itself, on the hate itself, and how to combat the hate itself, and that it's never ever turned into a political cudgel. And even though there are people that feel the way that you feel, and some of them legitimately so, and I don't doubt their sincerity in believing so, the truth is that when that narrative is converted into talking heads on political TV shows, that is the impression that comes across, and that's the narrative that people come away with, and they say, you know what, this is just an anti-Trump discussion. I don't want to be a part of it.
That's a different issue. Which, to be honest with you, I think that Trump does have a point when he uses the term fake news. I was one who earlier on looked seriously at getting into journalism, and one of my frustrations with journalism is one of the primary tenets of journalism is the reporting of the facts. All right, we as individuals have a right to our own opinions. We do not have a right to our own facts.
Correct.
And what has happened with journalism across the board, whether liberal or conservative, what has happened in my assessment is there is a quote-unquote reporting of the facts, and then there is the intent of the reporter to now tell me what I should think about the facts that have just been reported.
Especially when the reporter has no accountability.
Exactly.
That's what's dangerous.
And I think that in and of itself is extremely dangerous.
Dangerous.
It's
I think we
very,
all
very
agree.
dangerous.
And you say
And
very, very
whether
well.
it's CNN or whether it's Fox News, I think that there is a level of irresponsibility that is present in the news outlets and in the news media. That the emphasis is more so on sensationalism and who can beat who to the story and how best to sensationalize it, as opposed to vetting the information and making sure that what gets disseminated is actually the facts, and leave the listener to draw their own conclusions about the facts that have been reported. It's not being done. I know for a fact it's one of the reasons why Dan Rather got out of the business, because he did not like the direction in which the news outlets have
Yeah,
gone.
too much integrity.
And it's irresponsible, and I think it has factored into, in a major way, the climate that we have.
Okay, I want to come back to the question now.
Sure.
So what do we do? Because people are going to be watching
Sure.
this program, and they're going to find all of this fascinating.
Sure.
But in the end, people are asking two questions. These are two questions, Mark. How scared should I be? And what are we going to do to stop what seems to be a ball rolling down a hill and only getting more and more, getting more speed? That seems to be the two questions on people's minds. How scared should I be? And I'm still saying, I said a long time, and you've been with me a long time hearing me say this, as long as it was swastikas and people saying dumb things, while I didn't like it, I didn't feel it was a real threat.
Sure.
It began, and again, I'm saying this from within my own perspective here. It began for me when the Democratic Party permitted members of Congress to say anti-Semitic, anti-Israel things, and the grown-ups in the Democratic Party didn't say knock it off. And I believe that has created a momentum of its own.
So is that not politicizing?
By the way, unfortunately, it is. And again, it would be interesting in a different discussion which one of those has a greater effect on individuals. But what I'm saying is, I hear overt anti-Semitism and overt, explicit anti-Zionist rhetoric coming out of members of Congress. I don't care which party.
Right.
They happen to be Democrat at the moment. And I always
But
felt...
they all have a responsibility to be responsible, right?
I always felt as long as it never was institutionalized, it would never be really threatening and it would come and go. I'm not so sanguine now about the come and go. And what I see is a worldwide epidemic of anti-Semitism that it now is seeping. This could be only the beginning, and maybe we can clean it up before it gets really bad. But I feel people are worried, are frightened, and want to know, what can we do? I think that what you said earlier, Marc, about the Jewish leadership, I think many American Jews do not feel there's a strong Jewish leadership that has the helm here.
For the record, Thane said that, not me. I questioned their relationship, not the Jewish
Okay.
leaders themselves.
Yeah, and I want to go on the record again.
Yes.
To be clear, yes, I think that we have
Yes,
terrible
okay.
Jewish leadership,
I don't-
both. in
Better
the-
for you to say that than
Yeah, no, I don't want anyone to think Marc said it. I said it.
Okay,
No.
and I'm not sure what
You
you
didn't
meant
ask me if I
then
agreed,
when you
but
said,
again.
anytime you say you question the authenticity, it's a problem.
of their relationship.
Yes,
I
which
think
means
we
you
have-
you
So
were
can-
suggesting they don't really
can
have
I-
a relationship.
Can I answer your
No,
question?
I'm going to save you.
Yeah.
I want
I
to
think we
hear.
have very good Jewish leadership.
What?
We have very good Jewish leadership,
Okay.
but then I'm the only one here that represents a major Jewish
Okay,
organization.
and you feel that at the moment American Jewish leadership is saying what needs to be said and doing what needs to be done.
I think they are trying to. I think they know they need to do more. I think a lot of them have programs in place and good relationships in place and that are authentic. And they are, I think, just as worried by the onslaught and what seems to be a sudden kind of explosion of this. And I think and I know they're asking themselves very seriously, what do we do, what do we do, what do we do?
And they don't quite know.
And I think they have been trying to figure out what would be the best way to try and tackle this and not to try to fail at it. That's very important.
Can I insert something here? Just from my experience of the human dynamic, I've been pastoring 33 years, I've been in ministry 40 years, and I've worked with various groups, various people. What I have observed over the years, what tends to happen when there's a crisis is panic sets in. And people have a tendency to not act but react. And what often happens in the midst of panic is the blame game takes place.
That's true.
Now, what that does, though, is it takes the attention off of where it needs to be, which is we're in this fix. Now, let's move from reaction to action and devise a plan for how we can move forward.
Of course.
Now, I thought the mayor was eloquent and spot on in terms of immediate steps that need to be taken. One of the things that he said yesterday was, and this is immediate, that the Department of Education is going to create a new curriculum that's going to be focusing on tolerance and anti-hate. So they're going to be dealing with it throughout the schools. He also indicated that the police department is going to have an increased presence in those communities where those incidences are taking place, and that's being done immediately. The third thing that he stated was that there was going to be neighborhood safety coalitions that are going to be established throughout the city that's going to consist of community residents and stakeholders. Because when you look at history in terms of reform, it has always been galvanized by a ground-up movement as opposed to top-down. And so I think that where we get to the heart of this is as we begin to form coalitions on pavement level to enter into discussions and dialogues, and of course the optics is very, very important. I think communities need to actually see the evidence of African Americans standing with Jews, standing with others, and boldly declaring that our resolve is that it is not going to happen in our neighborhoods.
Good for you. By the way, it's a voice like yours that gives one hope.
Yes.
Same question now for all of you. So we're all worrying. How scared should we be, and what do we do?
I think I may have a remedy for this situation. I remember when I first got involved in the quote-unquote black Jewish business in 1990. So during the Crown Heights riots, 1991, I got a call from Howard Rubenstein, the famous PR executive. And he says, Marc, do you have a relationship with Michael Jordan? I said, no, I don't. I said, Howard, why are you asking me that? He said, don't you realize if we can get Michael Jordan into the streets right now, that this riot would be over because of the influence that man has. I think the only way to really put this bay is to identify the influencers in the various communities to begin speaking out. 99.999% of humanity are followers. There are very, very few influencers. Whether it's influencers in the African American community, I only wish we had those influencers in the Jewish community. You know, if we had an Elie Wiesel personality like that, he had that impact on the Jewish community, but we really don't have those personalities today. And what was really the method to my madness this morning, because I know the influence that Al Sharpton has on the African American community. I know what it means for him to speak out against anti-Semitism and to point out how the perpetrators, many, if not most of these attacks, are African Americans. If we could get more and more of the influencers, whether it's in the church, whether it's in entertainment, whether it's in the hip-hop field, whether it's celebrities, people will follow these personalities. And I think that is what is lacking. I'm all for coalition building. Listen, I've dedicated my whole life, adult life, to coalition building. And I'm all for interfaith rallies and gatherings and everything else. Marc, it's about the influencers. If the influencers would step up to the plate and take a stand, you will see the impact that they could have on their respective communities.
Dovid, is this only a black-white issue? Black-Jewish issue? Yes or no?
No.
Right. So how frightened should people be, and what do we do about it? Do you have any answer yet for yourself?
You know, Nathan Sharansky famously referred to the 3 Ds in his reference to anti-Semitism becoming, or anti-Israelism becoming anti-Semitism. So I call it the 4 Cs. First of all, we need to care. Not enough people care. We here sitting around the table are engaged and involved and care. There are too many that couldn't care less. The second, we've got to have courage. Fear is never a good response. Fear is paralyzing.
Yes.
As Winston Churchill famously said that courage is rightly esteemed as the first of human qualities because it is the one by which all others are guaranteed. And third, we've got to call it out. We have to raise our voices from every possible platform that we can find and identify the hatred, call out the perpetrators, and make sure everybody knows that we are concerned and won't accept it. Draw that line in the sand as far and as deep as it needs to be. And the 4th C, counteract. And that involves some of the initiatives that the Rabbi mentioned, engaging other leaders. It involves security initiatives. It involves education initiatives. It involves community building initiatives. There's a whole lot that can be done, but only standing on the bedrock of the previous 3.
Okay. So, last time, you same question. You know, when I look
Are
at
you going to call on me too?
I thought that was your answer. You want to give me an answer? I said to you, what do we do?
I just wanted to say, first of all, I agree with my 2 colleagues at the table. I think
Yes.
it's very important. I think they've said a lot, and I don't want to just repeat that. But I do want to address one of the things that you raised when people say, you know, what am I doing? Why is this happening to us? And I think that's a twofold question. So the answer is twofold. On the one hand, there is a sort of inevitability about it in the sense that we say every Passover that in every generation there are those who rise up against us. So in a sense, it's not going away. It hasn't gone away. And for whatever reason, it simmers below the surface and then it percolates to the top. But the other question is, well, we have this element of tshuva, of repentance, and asking ourselves, well, we have a role to play in this world as Jews. We talk about being a light unto the nations. We talk about being an example. We talk about trying to lead in a moral fashion, that's a lesson a legacy we've inherited that we have to pass on and perpetrate. So we have to ask ourselves, and we do. We have Yom Kippur, but it's not just once a year. Rosh Chodesh is also a Yom Kippur. We say at the beginning of every month. And we need to remind ourselves, well, how are we falling short of that? And maybe we are sometimes falling short of that. And we need to say, well, if we're supposed to lead, they'll tell us, if you don't, well, get out of the way. So we have to heed what's going on here, that things sometimes happen for some kind of a reason, and there has to be a certain kind of introspection that goes on within our own community. So the question you're asking is not really just one of people who are trying of self-flagellation or trying to blame themselves because Jews have a conscience, and Jews also are trying to see what can we do to make it better. And I think we need to ask ourselves, what can I do personally and in my community to make ourselves better so that we really are admirable and a light unto the nations, And I think that would have a lot to do in conjunction with everything else that has been said here.
Okay.
And by the way, and now we know who's the real rabbi at this table.
Okay.
It was a beautiful Devar Torah moment. Okay. Yeah,
Thank you, Marc.
it was beautiful.
Forgive me. It upsets me to my core what you just said. If Jews were never a light unto the nations, nobody should be punching them.
Absolutely.
Nobody should be shooting them.
I agree.
No, you don't
I'm
agree.
not saying that we deserve it. I
Okay.
didn't say that.
Okay.
And I
But-
don't mean it
okay,
either.
Because that's what I heard you say right now was that we aren't really doing enough to be the kind of light to the nations that we want to be. That may be true. And in a different discussion, at a different roundtable, that may be that would be an interesting thing to discuss. To what extent do Jews live up to what it means to be Jews? And to what extent is what Dovid said exactly true? Most Jews don't care. But in a discussion of anti-Semitism, the suggestion that what's happening to us has anything to do with what we're not is what I heard people say during the Holocaust. And God let it happen. And God makes it happen. And I know that's not what you mean. But that's what you will be heard to be saying, and that's what you said. So for me, the notion that we want to be a light unto the nations and we're not doing good enough is irrelevant to me in this discussion. So in that degree, while I normally agree with you almost 100%, on this thing, I do not feel, as Rabbi Schneier feels, that was the Devar Torah I want anyone to take away. And in a discussion outside of this table, outside of the cameras, you and I would have this discussion. It's very hard for me to believe that as committed as you are to what it means to be a real, authentic, observant, morally striving Jew, that you believe that anti-Semitism is in any way related to what Jews are not yet fulfilling in their messianic quest.
I think when you don't fulfill your destiny, people get angry.
Okay, so it is our fault.
No.
What do you mean
Anti-Semitism is not deserved. Violence is not deserved.
no? But
I'm
we
not
get it
saying
because
that.
we're not fulfilling our destiny.
Yes.
Well, okay. Excuse me. It's hard for me to believe you believe that. I don't
No,
believe
I
it.
said it was.
I
no,
don't
excuse
believe
me,
that. And
excuse
I don't
me.
want Jews to believe that.
Marc, I congratulate her on a Devar Torah. But as any good rabbi
That'll be
should
the
know,
last time
that
you-
doesn't mean that everyone in the audience agrees with the Devar Torah.
Yes, do you
But
agree
there
with-
is
do
there
you
is
agree
a
with it?
school of thought.
Do you? I don't care. Do you agree with it?
I have to remember the exact Devar Torah before I respond. Do I agree that because
We are
we're
not
not
living
living
up
up
to
to
our
our
destiny,
destiny,
therefore this is happening to
I
us.
respectfully do not agree with it.
Okay.
But it is still a Devar Torah.
I think there's another.
You got a good. You got a great. You got an A for a Devar Torah. Content-wise, there's problems to it in my mind.
That's okay.
But it was a
Okay.
good Devar
That's
Torah.
I think there's another important point.
to be continued.
To be continued.
There's another important point to be made, and I think it's one that the former chief rabbi of the Commonwealth has made on a few occasions, and that
So
is
by Rabbi Sachs.
Rabbi Sachs. That is, in these discussions and at times like this, it's very important not to assume the posture of victimhood on behalf of the community, because we don't want to define ourselves as a people through victimhood. I mean, people are going to think, as Lord
That's
Sachs
not what I'm
once said,
doing, by the way. Okay.
are going to think twice and three times about having Jewish grandkids if that's what it means, if they're going to be conferring the status of victimhood to their children. The fight against anti-Semitism is not so much a fight against something as it is a fight for something. It's a fight for ethics. It's a fight for morals. It's a fight for justice. It's a fight for our rights to a place in this world and to be accepted among the nations. And I think it's important when we engage in discussions like this to keep that in mind. What we stand for is more important than what we stand against.
I wanted to insert something interesting that Dr. King once said regarding law. He said that the law will never make my enemy love me, but the law will keep him from lynching me.
I like that.
And so, again, we can talk philosophically about our differences, but at the end of the day, you have persons of a particular culture who have been pointed out and victimized, and there are laws against that. And what's being done now, and that's why I was very, very happy that at that press conference was not just the mayor making his statement, but the mayor was standing shoulder to shoulder with the police commissioner, standing shoulder to shoulder with the Attorney General, with congressional people, with local elected officials, and with clergy. Because the statement that we were seeking to make to the cameras, to the city, is that we are not going to accept this.
Yeah, but
And we're going to work together to make sure that we put an end to this.
Do I speak or do you? Do I, and then come to you? Or you want to speak first?
it's up to you. It's
Okay.
your show. It's up to your show. I always defer to you, Mark.
Okay. I want you to have the last word, so I'm going to speak for a moment. Part of the problem that the mayor faces and the police commissioner faces is that we've seen at the moment, and earlier tonight I was speaking with the CEO of B'nai B'rith International, and he was bemoaning the fact that whether it's New York or San Francisco, the laws have been changed so that people are released. And they're released even if they do slap somebody in the face. And that I hope you're right, but what we need to see is a different mentality from our mayor and a different mentality from the police chief, which says, no, we're going to go back to law and order. And you know what? Nobody has the right to accost anybody. And if you do, there will be serious consequences. Not a slap on the wrist, and you will be incarcerated, and you will have to face justice. Until that happens, the problem is many people just won't be moved. Although I know you are, and I believe you are for the right reasons. But I'm saying to you that the greater context at the moment is problematic for that.
But also understand that even when you say law and order, see, African Americans have a different experience
Yes, I know.
during the Giuliani administration.
I know. And
Where
No,
there was
his-
documented,
historically.
and Bloomberg,
I know.
places
Historically,
I know.
where there was definite
Yes.
abuses of stop and frisk, and African Americans were disproportionately targeted. So
yes, and that's why law and order has slowly eroded, because we are sensitive to the abuses. And the question is, nobody came up with really sophisticated ways to end abuse without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And at the moment, people in general have a sense that, and I don't know if I'm speaking for the African American community or not, but there are many people who just feel that our society is far less committed to a rule of law than it once was. That being said, all of this is interesting for another discussion. I want to say this and then you wrap up. The reason why I wanted you all here, and the reason why I think this is very important, is that I sense a fear in the Jewish community that there's something new that sort of just is symbolized by what happened in Monsey. There have been other terrible things, and especially when the Tree of Life synagogue was shot up and 11 people were killed, that brought the Jewish community up short. But there's something that feels different today. I do not believe it is simply that the African American community is assaulting Jews. I don't believe it's an African American problem. What I do believe is we shouldn't pretend it doesn't exist at all in the African American community. And for you in Sharpton to stand shoulder to shoulder, and Victor has said this as well, I think it's a major step, and I'm very anxious to see where that goes. But what this entire period has reminded us is that anti-Semitism is so deeply ingrained in the world. As Daniel Goldhagen wrote, in places where a Jew has never lived, there's anti-Semitism. And we have been relatively free of it since the 50s here in America. And suddenly, it's really suddenly, it seems to have been bubbled up. And it's almost like once you let it out of the can, it's hard to get it back into the can. And so the concern now is, to what extent is this going to simply slowly but more and more and more grow? And while I don't think the comparisons with Nazi Germany are just ludicrous, at the same time, as comfortable as Jews have been, and you said it eloquently yourself, is that over? And Jews here, as you also say, so many don't care. What tends to awaken Jews is anti-Semitism. I've never wanted anti-Semitism to be a reason Jews come back to being Jewish. But at the moment, all of this is in play. And what I hear people say is, it's out of the bottle. And I don't know what you can do with this cancerous infection once it's out of the bottle. You had to keep it in the bottle. Once it's out of the bottle, it's a problem. And I want our Jewish leadership to be louder. I want people to have the courage you have. I want professors on college campus to say what you're saying.
Good luck.
I want leaders of Jewish organizations to say what you're saying.
Good luck.
I want journalists who are writing as you, what you're saying. And no one is more important than someone like you inside your community, but it's bigger than your community.
Without question.
And when you said it comes from the bottom up, I want the bottom level leadership to say in no uncertain terms, this is unacceptable, and we support laws, even if it's law and order, we support laws that make this now criminal, and if you violate it, we will not tolerate excuses. It's really because the Jews are gentrifying. It's if the Jews didn't do this and that. No, it has nothing to do with what we do. Nothing what we do, and nothing what we're not. And I want American Jewry to hear that from all of us. I don't want them to be afraid. I want them to wear a yarmulke anywhere I believe that even though every now and then some Jew is attacked, the vast 99% of Jews walk anywhere in America and they're never bothered. And then one day they'll walk on Midtown Manhattan, a block away from Grand Central Station, and somebody will attack them there. And we don't want that anymore. And the question is, I haven't yet heard, really, how we get at this seeping cancer, other than people around this table and people like you and people.
No, you heard it. You heard it today.
Yeah?
You heard. Look, you have to care. You have to stand. No.
Influencers.
You have to engage with the society and with society leadership. If we
Yes.
don't do that, are we living up to our destiny?
It's not about
No.
destiny.
If we are not caring, if we don't care about other
It
Jews,
doesn't matter if we
not
care.
living up to our
Jews
destiny.
shouldn't be beaten up, even if they
That's
don't
right.
care.
But I think we all
I'm not
agree
saying
on that.
we
all
deserve
agree
it.
on
That's
that.
the mistake you're making, and
It
it's
won't-
understanding
and
me.
it won't stop it.
But I'm
It
saying,
won't
But
stop
Marc,
it. If
let's
every Jew
also-
cared, if every Jew became an observant Jew, it would do nothing
Marc,
for
let's also be
anti-Semitism.
grateful. Maybe we conclude on this note.
No.
Before we hear from Thane, let's also be grateful that we're living at a time in Jewish history with the #1 game changer, and that's the state of Israel.
Okay, I've talked and talked and talked. Everybody's talked. What's your sense of all this?
Mark, you mean the state of Israel that gets condemned in the United Nations and
I'm
is
talking
the
about
only
the state of
and the only
Israel
nation in the world
that will
that is
always-
delegitimized
that will always
and is,
protect
and
that will always protect and defend the honor and the dignity of any Jew wherever he or she may live.
Right, but
first time in 2,000 years, and I choose to magnify my blessings and not to exaggerate my troubles.
I think both of those things are true. Thank God there is Israel, but let us not pretend how many enemies Israel
No
has
one's pretending
around the world.
But
And
thank
so this
God
is-
we have a state of Israel for
Okay,
enemies
yeah,
to
well,
protest.
Right, but here we're seeing another example of enemies. We're seeing a very different a look to it. Let me just see if I can try to sum up something. First of all, Mark, your friend Al Sharpton. The novelist in me would love for him to have said today, I may have been the part of a problem in 1989 at Crown Heights, and now I want to be leading the solution here.
He has expressed those
Okay, that's what I mean. If he has,
Yes.
I will feel
Yes.
much better.
He has expressed
yeah,
those
words, because
Yes.
that's what Marc was trying to say,
Yes.
which is to say, I happen to know I'm not related to Yankel Rosenbaum at all. I'm not Australian and I'm not Hasidic, but he would have been alive today, I think, had Al Sharpton said other things in 1980.
Even though Sharpton arrived on the scene after the killing of Rosenbaum.
Okay.
That's neither here nor there.
So that's my response to Al Sharpton. I hope that he sees the poignance of his leadership here, how symbolic and how important it would be, and how much it would do to for us, people who are more cynical about him and his motives and his history.
It's a process.
Right. I want to see that guy.
Okay.
As for Michael Jordan, I do not think LeBron James is going to go to Crown Heights or Borough Park. He'd be the best influencer, and in the absence of that, I don't think we're going to get that. I think what we do are seeing.
Sotomayor.
You have to ask.
Okay, but I don't
he's
think.
never been asked,
but I
no.
do think that when Victor's talking about today's press conference, I'm not interested in photo ops. I'm not interested in photo ops. Really good pictures.
It was last night's press conference.
It's not interesting to me. I think that what we're seeing is a casualness about crimes committed against Jews. There's a casualness about saying that Israel has no right to exist, and there's a casualness about, those silly African Americans or threw a rock at somebody, whatever, instead of saying, whoa, what? Someone just got beaten up in Crown Heights. And yes, clearly, where it comes to, in my mind, the failure of Jewish leadership is, as you said, press releases not identifying the fact that this is happening in Jewish enclaves by African Americans. No matter who is responsible, we have to be able to say what's happening. We have to be able to speak honestly. And I love that you use the words. I think that one of the reasons why Donald Trump was elected was because President Obama refused to talk about Islam in any other way other than it being a religion of peace. And there just seems something intellectually dishonest about that. And I'm so happy and pleased to hear Victor saying, yes, this is what's most distressing, that this is happening with African Americans. We have to be able to say this because we cannot tolerate the casualness of crimes. Yes, stop and frisk was abused. Yes, there's a disproportionate number of African Americans that are in prison. But that can't be the reason why we don't prosecute these crimes against Jews today. It can't be the reasons why we treat these. We are, Victor. We are treating. I'm not saying you're saying that. What I'm saying, let me just say this. I think Bill de Blasio has been saying that for 6 weeks. I think he has been incredibly casual, irresponsible. 6 weeks ago, he talked about a special task force. Nothing has happened, and more Jews are dead. More Jews are being attacked. We are not applying hate crime laws in the same way we have with other communities. We're simply treating this as, again, a part of the white power, white establishment, white elite, and a victimized community that no one cares about. They're religious Jews. They're Hasidic Jews. They're not the other Jews. They're not like us. And so, because they're not like us, and by the way, I'll say this, I said it again, I'm the only Jewish person here not wearing a yarmulke, and I want to be the person that's the most defending the Hasidim who live in these neighborhoods.
So that's me.
I do think that this is part of another aspect that we're not acknowledging, that we don't take crimes against them more seriously. So we have this perfect storm. We have victims who seem less sympathetic because they're ultra-Orthodox. And we have the oppressors who were really uncomfortable in prosecuting or taking this more seriously. Hopefully, what we're doing in stepping forward is to do something about this. Because one of the things that you've said before about never again, no one wants to see further Jewish blood under anyone's watch. It's going to be our fault. It's going to be we were the ones that watched this and didn't take it seriously and didn't push. What do I want to see? I want to see the congressmen who were opposed, again, the Black Caucus, They were opposed to a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. I want to see that on the table on January 3rd. I want to see one of those members of the Black Caucus to say, you know what, we might have been too precipitous. We were too sensitive about it. We probably should have let an anti-Semitism resolution. We don't want to appear to be African-American legislators who don't take anti-Semitism seriously, and we subsume it, we collapse it within a general broader categories of discrimination. We are African-Americans, we understand what persecution means, and we are not pretending that Jews don't have a history of persecution. We are not pretending they're just rich white people. And so I want to see that resolution revived. I want to see the 107 Congress people who responded to Pompeo saying, yes, but we can sign another letter. Here's our other letter. Our letter is absolutely condemning anti-Semitism. I want to see hate crime legislation really being imposed against those people. I want to see influencers. I want to see more African Americans in the communities actually speaking out. And hopefully, Marc, that's what you're telling us we're about to see. We know this is what Victor does in Staten Island. We need to see much more of this. But what I'm concerned about is the casualness of it, that this is something that we listen to platitudes, oh, this is a terrible thing, and then we go about our day and do something else. And I think that that's what I'm most concerned about. We've been asleep at the switch. We've been watching this go on for 2 years in Crown Heights, in other enclaves. We believe this was a problem in Paris and in other parts, and now we see it's come here. And if it's come here, we have to stop it here. We have to take it seriously here. We have to become committed to a zero-tolerance policy and not a casualness about these crimes.
By the way, I would love to give you time, but I am now grabbed by the proverbial clock. Okay. It is so wonderful that all of you came in. But by the way, this is your first time here.
Yes.
You are welcome anytime.
Thank you.
You
Appreciate
have
that.
enormous insights on human nature and life.
Yes,
and
thank you. Thank you.
thank you for being here.
Appreciate it.
You are a lovely soul.
Thank you.
And for all of you, I love each of you so much. Thank you, Marc, for everything you do and for being here. And kol hakavod for what you did today. And you may really, and I know, but we even haven't talked about all you're doing for world peace, for God's sake. Just amazing. Dovid, I love you. I think what you're doing is fabulous with the Allgemeiner. And it's wonderful that you come here. You should come here all the time. Now that I'm just down a block from you, we should see each other all the time. So thank you. And you, my sweetheart.
We haven't finished our conversation.
No, we will.
Okay.
But I love
We
you.
have not
I love you.
Anyway,
I love
anyway.
you. We can disagree, and I love you like crazy. And you know, I think there's no one like you, by the way.
No,
And what
thank
you do for the Jewish world
Thank
is
you.
beyond.
I even got a compliment from Marc today. It doesn't happen every day. Just want you to know.
And you, my dear friend, always at my side. You're articulate, and you're eloquent, and I appreciate your passion and your brain. So thank you for being here. Thank all of you very, very much. And there you have it. Thane Rosenbaum, Bishop Victor Brown, Betty Ehrenberg, Dovid Efune, and Marc Schneier. I hope in some way there's been some light that has come out of this discussion. This is not the end of it. This issue, unfortunately, is now with us. And so we will gather again to discuss this further as we begin the new year together. And as always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed by any of my guests or by me. And I would love to know, are you personally frightened by anti-Semitism today? Let me know. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, and tweet me. You know all of the addresses already, but you can reach me at Rabbi Golub at jbstv.org. My thanks to our director, Sloan Copeland, JBS's Associate Director, Dara Golub, Technical Manager, Michael Paley, Transmission Manager, John McDevitt, and to the producer of this special edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Marc Golub. Be well, my friends.